It's one thing to speculate that this pandemic has caused an inordinate amount of stress for women, but when you see the hard numbers, there is little room to dispute the impact. Dr. Andrea Gonzalez is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University and a member of the Alford Center of Child Studies. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Family Health and Preventative Interventions. She is the lead author of the Ontario Parent Survey, which examines the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown on caregivers and their children. She hopes these findings will help inform practice and policy changes to support families during these unprecedented times. She is personally coping with the stressors of COVID-19 by enjoying time with her husband and 10-year-old son, biking, taking walks, losing at board games, and eating lots of ice cream bars. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thanks so much, Candace, for having me.
So this study I read with fascination, but let's just sort of lay out, when did you conduct the study? Over what time period?
So we launched the study at the beginning of May, and then it ran until mid-June. So I think we closed it on June 19th. So it was open for about 6 or 7 weeks, and it would have really encompassed that initial lockdown period, because I think it was, we hadn't even had any of the phased reopenings yet.
Okay, and how many people were surveyed then?
So this was what we call a crowdsourcing or web-based survey. So we had sent the link around widely to all sorts of partner agencies, so public health units, Ontario Early Years Centres, various school boards across the province, and child and youth mental health lead agencies, and then different parenting groups shared it on their social media platforms. And we had an overwhelming response. We were actually thinking we were only going to get about 2,000 people, and we got over 7,000 that actually responded. And these were caregivers with children ages 0 to 17 years. So it represented, parents with all sorts of different kinds of parenting experiences.
And that's probably a little bit indicative of the fact that, people were locked in their homes, very connected, and were able to access the survey on, if life was running normally. Probably wouldn't have had the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people really wanted to have their voice heard. Like we at the end of the survey, we left options for like text box responses or written responses. And we had so many people write, like close to 4,000 people wrote in those open-ended text boxes to kind of individualize their experiences for us, which was actually quite humbling and quite interesting too for us.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the specifics then. What were some of the most alarming things that came out of this?
Yeah, I think we sort of knew or suspected, and I know from my own personal experience, that this was going to be very stressful for Ontario families, but what was surprising to us were the actual numbers. So we had close to 60% of caregivers sort of have very high levels of depressive symptoms. So this isn't a diagnostic tool that we used. It's not indicative of major depression, but these are symptoms that are associated with like clinically relevant depression. And when we looked further in the data, because that number was so shocking to us, and the actual individual items, what we were finding is it was things like feeling overwhelmed and not being able to stay on top of things, or having the energy to do things, or sleep patterns being disrupted. So those things that were really tapping into how stressed parents were. The other major finding was that about a third of parents were reporting moderate to severe anxiety. Again, not surprising given the circumstances we were all in, but surprising in the fact that there were so many people reporting that. And then I think the third major thing for us was that we asked parents how their children were doing, and about 40% indicated that their child's behavior and mood was worse since the pandemic had started. So again, it was a very high statistic, and just about another 38% were reporting that their children's behavior and mood was the same, and only 12% was indicating that their children were actually doing better since the pandemic started. But even that is a little bit concerning, because you have to wonder, like, is it that children are sort of escaping, separation anxiety or bullying or those kinds of circumstances. So in the short term, they might be better, but we don't know what they'll actually look like in the long term.
So I don't know if you watched have you seen the Social Dilemma on Netflix yet, but so I read with interest the part in your study about screen time.
Mm-hmm.
So parents had a lot of concerns in and around that.
Yeah, absolutely. We asked parents specifically about COVID types of stressors or experiences that were concerning to them. And an overwhelming percentage, I think it was 50% or slightly more, indicated that they were worried about the amount of screen time that their children were now experiencing. And it came from many sources. So we hear from Canadian Pediatric Society and American Pediatric Society about how screens aren't good. And then here, all of a sudden, we're thrown into a circumstance where there's almost nothing but screens. Because, if they were involved in distance learning, it was all on screens. If they were trying to make sure that their kids weren't feeling isolated and could still interact with friends, it was via a screen. And then also for the working moms, and because our survey was mostly mothers or female caregivers, in order to balance things, they kind of had to loosen their typical screen time rules because they needed to work. And so kids were having access to more of their screen, whether it's video games or TVs or whatever. So
yeah, it was a complete adjustment period for everybody. You suddenly go from, having all this structure in your life to no structure and having to work at home and manage everybody's priorities. So what were some of the specifics that you heard? Was there anything, that in those notes that you received that sort of alarmed you or makes you want to take a deeper dive on this?
Yeah, I think we're having a qualitative researcher actually pull out the themes, but just in looking through them myself, there were a few things that sort of stood out. It didn't matter the age of the child that the parent was talking about or that they had, but isolation was a major concern. So for younger kids, first of all, for fairly new mothers with infants or toddlers, there were major concerns about how isolated they were feeling during the postpartum period, and their infants not having any kind of social interaction and what kind of impact that would have on their development. And then for the more middle school kind of adolescent age children, it was about how isolated they were feeling, missing their peers and their friends, which is a major part of development in terms of that age group, and also missed milestones. So we had parents talking about missing grade 8 graduation, missing the prom, and what a negative experience that was for their children. And one mom was actually reporting how her child ran away in order to kind of cope, and how challenging that was for the family. A second theme that sort of emerged was, and in relation to isolation, it wasn't just the kids feeling isolated, it was also the parents. So they had no escape and no relief, I guess, really, and how isolated they were feeling because they weren't even seeing their extended family members, and how much extended family really plays into caregiving relief, really. And we have the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, and all of a sudden your village is gone. And what does that mean, both for the parent and for the child? And then the second, major theme was about balance. And a lot of these moms, a big proportion of them were working mothers or female caregivers, and trying to balance that and the distance learning. So all of a sudden they had 3 hats that they were trying to wear. One was being the regular parent, the second was being the teacher and the manager of the distance learning, and then the third was being an employee. And trying to maintain whatever obligations they had related to work, and the amount of stress and strain that caused both on them, but the family as a whole too.
Okay. So if people want to know more, then they want to actually get all of the information that you compiled and read into this, where can they find this study?
So we have a website. It's www.strongfamilies.ca, and both the infographic, so it's just a 1-page high-level kind of stats, is posted there, as well as the 10-page executive summary, which kind of does a deeper delve into the overall findings across the study.
Okay, incredible. Thank you so much. We'll put that up on the video that goes out on social. Thank you so much
Great.
for joining me today.
Okay, thank you. Take care.